John Maynard Smith is one of Britain's most brilliant scientists. Born in 1920, he was sent to Eton, where he learned mathematics and boxing, but little else. He then trained as an aeronautical engineer before moving into biology after the Second World War. Maynard Smith is a world authority on evolutionary theory and genetics, and is most famous for the use of advanced mathematics to analyse sex. Professor of biology at Sussex University for more than 30 years, his 7 wonders of the world include space travel, bee orchids and sidewinding snakes.
I remember my first experiment, as a matter of fact, and I must have been really quite young, because I was ignorant about the facts of life, clearly, and I didn't know what the navel was for. And I observed that I was getting bigger and other people were getting bigger, but my skin wasn't getting tighter. So I formed a hypothesis that the skin was being paid out from my navel. So I drew little circles around my navel and measured them daily, but then was washed off. It's the story of my life, actually, good hypotheses and badly executed experiments. The problem for a sidewinding snake is that it lives in the desert on very soft, shifting sand. And if it tries to move like most snakes move, by sort of pushing against the ground, all that happens is the sand sort of slishes out of the way and the snake finds itself more or less where it was before. It's rather like trying to walk on ice. Your feet just slip away from you and you haven't got anywhere. So they've invented a particularly cunning way of travelling across the ground. And I must say, when I first met it, it took me quite a long time to work out what was going on. And the best place to start, actually, is by looking at the track that they leave behind them, which consists of a series of lines in the sand. Imagine the snake starting off lying on this line here. It lifts its head up and puts it down there. So its body is lying like this. And then gradually it puts itself down onto this line and lifts itself up from there. And it gradually unwinds until it's sort of looking like this, let's say. And then it starts lifting its head up again and putting it down there. And all the time, it's picking its body off one track and putting it down on the next one. Its body between the tracks is off the ground. I've never seen one of these, and I must emphasize that I was not, of course, the first person to work this out. I find myself obsessed with something I don't understand. And this has been true again ever since I can remember. I've tried to find out why things were like they are, and particularly if grown-ups wouldn't tell me, I got more obsessed. And I would sort of try to work out how it happens. And I think that, but then I suspect most kids are like that, aren't they? The trouble is that only some of us are lucky enough to spend our lives indulging the habit. But most kids want to know how the world works, I think. My father was a surgeon, but he died when I was 8, and I hardly knew him. My mother didn't know anything about science. My family knew nothing about science. My school actually knew nothing about science. So I have to say they taught me mathematics very well. They taught me no science whatever. I do remember that even at my prep school, I was known as Professor Meat Juice. So I must have looked like a professor even when I was quite a small boy. It's partly having these ridiculous glasses, you know, and peering myopically at things. And then I went on to Eton, which was, on the whole, it considered that if a boy was clever, he did Latin and Greek. And since I can't do Latin and Greek, they decided I wasn't very clever. If you couldn't do that, then you were allowed to try and do mathematics. And they did that very well, I'll give them that. There was one person who my schoolmasters at Eton absolutely hated, and that was J.B.S. Haldane. They hated him because he was a renegade. I mean, he was one of them. He was an old Etonian. There he was going around spouting atheism and socialism and all this sort of stuff. They really hated him, and I remember thinking that anybody they hate that much can't be all bad. And I went off to the school library, and to give them their credit, his books were in the library. And I remember reading Possible Worlds, and it completely blew me away. And it was a combination of intelligence, of simple mathematical models of the world, of blasphemy. I mean, all mixed up. I mean, it was just a mind. I didn't know there were people out there like that. I can remember reading the essay about the philosophical barnacles, and it completely changed my life, there's no question. I went to University College quite consciously because I knew Haldane was a teacher there. People say I worked in his laboratory, but it's an absolute nonsense. He wasn't allowed in the laboratory. I mean, he was dangerous in the laboratory. We kept him out. He was not an easy person to work with. But I worked in his group for 7 or 8 years, I suppose. I've been fascinated by the way birds fly ever since I can remember. One of the very earliest things I can remember almost is looking at seagulls and so on and thinking they were beautiful. And there's something particularly moving, I think, about birds that can fly without ever actually flapping their wings. And the expert is the albatross. It just flies indefinitely without ever beating its wings. And that's a puzzle, if you think about it, because, all right, vultures do the same, but they have updrafts. The vulture is just riding the upcurrent. But an albatross has no upcurrents. There aren't any upcurrents over the sea. And it has to rely entirely on the fact that the wind is blowing, and the wind is slower against the sea than it is 50 feet up because of the friction. And the albatross has sort of worked out, I don't suppose it did the sums, but it's worked out a way of flying forever, just using the fact that the wind isn't the same speed everywhere. And I think that's really rather clever of it. Basically what it does is, starting at sea level, it faces into wind and climbs, glides uphill, and of course as it goes up it loses speed relative to the ground, but because the wind is faster up there it doesn't lose airspeed. And then when it gets up to 50 feet it turns down again, but now it glides downwards going downwind, and again it doesn't lose airspeed. Always for me the wonder is the combination of a gorgeous piece of natural history like that with a kind of piece of mathematics, with a piece of explanation. Now, the maddening thing about this, from my point of view, is that I worked that out myself during the war when I was an engineer, and I was furious to discover that Lord Rayleigh had it all worked out, I don't know, 100 years before I did. Story of my life, I'm always discovering things and then discovering that other people have already published it. I'd always rather work something out than read it in the published papers. It's just much more fun. The trouble about reading the papers first, I mean, you go into a new field, you'd think the right thing to do would be to read what everybody else has said about it. If you do that, you finish up accepting their questions as well as their answers as being what matters in that subject. And maybe they're wrong. Maybe they're asking the wrong questions. If you go into it ignorant, like I do, and read as little as possible, and plunge in and try and solve things, occasionally you make a complete idiot of yourself, and I do that quite often, but I don't mind too much. People are used to it by now. But occasionally I ask a question that other people haven't asked, and provide an answer that other people haven't provided. And, you know, that's much more fun. The tipple top, of course, is not wonderful or magic like an albatross. I mean, you don't get this enormous lift from seeing it. It's a kid's toy, and it's quite amusing. And when you spin it, very much to one's surprise, it starts spinning, and then it turns over and spins on its top. It's surprising. It's odd. It's just a little sphere with just a little bit of the top sawn off and a little peg sticking out. And that's really all there is to it. There's nothing, no little gremlin inside or anything magic. The thing that is dramatic about it, to me, is that it's possible mathematically to predict that it is going to do that. It's quite a hard piece of mathematics, and not one that I think I could have done, though I can follow it when it's been done by someone else. It's really quite tricky, but it's based literally on Newton's laws of motion. I mean, there's no more to it than Newton's basic ideas of the laws of motion. from that, together with mathematical reasoning, you can actually predict that if you spin that thing, it'll turn up and stand on it, spin on its stalk. And I forget who it was, I suspect Einstein was it, who said the remarkable thing about the world is that one can understand it. He said something like that, I haven't got it quite right. It's the comprehensibility of the world that is so extraordinary. And even more extraordinary that it should be understood by mathematics, which is so abstract and so weird, and these strange marks on a piece of paper with squiggles and arrows and things, and that kind of thinking can explain anything from a tipple top to an albatross, I find really very remarkable. I think it's important to say that although there is a clear mathematical explanation of why it turns over onto its point, it's not a mathematical explanation which I think could be put into words. People sometimes say to me, well, not in this context, but in other contexts, you know, there's a bit of mathematics showing that something is the case. Couldn't you explain it without the mathematics? And the answer is sometimes, really, no, you can't. At least I can't see it without the maths. Maths is so much easier than words. That's the point you have to understand. I mean, mathematics makes things clear that words merely muddle and confuse and mess up. And so you have to have the mathematics in order to follow the reasoning through and to find out exactly what will happen. I didn't in fact become a scientist at university. I read engineering at Cambridge. And then the war broke out while I was an undergraduate. And I went, after I graduated, I went and worked in the aircraft industry and was what's called an aircraft stressman. I did all the sums to find out whether the wings were going to break and that kind of thing. In 1946-47, I'd more or less decided that I was going to leave engineering and become an academic scientist. I decided I wanted to do biology because it's easier than physics. I mean, I find physics fascinating, but nevertheless, physics is immensely difficult. It seems to me, at least theoretical physics. And I suppose even then I knew that I was really a theoretician rather than an experimentalist. And the theoretical physicists I know are, I mean, their mathematics is orders of magnitude better than mine would ever be. And, I mean, if you think of, you know, what really important contributions to theoretical physics are like, they're just terribly hard, I think. Whereas any idiot could do biology, really. The real problem of being a land plant is how do you get your pollen to another plant? I mean, you can't sort of pull up your roots and walk across and chatter up, so to speak, which is what, you know, ordinary people would do. You've got somehow or other, you've got to get the pollen there. And some plants, in a rather boring way, I mean, grasses, for example, does produce a great mass of pollen which blows about in the wind. But most interesting flowering plants do it by using insects to carry it for them, and they make bright flowers. And the insect comes along and thinks, I kind of like the nectar I got out of that flower, so it flies to another flower of the same kind, carrying the pollen along with it. But the really weird ones are for me, the bee orchids, which persuade a bee to come to them, not by just simply being brightly coloured and having some nectar when you get there, but of actually looking like a bee. Look at them, if you see them a bit in the distance, they really do look like a little bee settled on a flower. And not only do they look like a bee, they actually smell like a bee. They have the female attractant hormone. And a male bee will come along, he actually tries to copulate with the flower. And then, I dare say, feeling pretty frustrated, he thinks, to hell with this, and he flies off. And he sees another one, and he thinks, right, that one will be all right, and he flies to that. And that way carries the pollen. Now, that's magic, I think. All done by natural selection. I mean, if you can believe that, you can believe anything. But actually, I do believe it. You know, I really do think that that's just a simple product of natural selection, but so complex and so unexpected that it's very moving. I think if everything was perfect, God would be really rather a good explanation of things like bee orchids. But why he should have given me an appendix which blew up and nearly killed me when I was 15 is a harder thing to understand. And, you know, people say, oh, well, he just wanted you to suffer, but I don't actually. I can't go around believing in a God who thinks suffering is good for me. It's a load of nonsense. It's the imperfections that make God an implausible hypothesis. But yes, it is, in a sense, an act of faith to say this arose by natural selection. But the faith isn't sort of blind faith. It's that people have thought very hard about the question of how could such things evolve. And apart from creation, the only, even remotely plausible explanation anyone has given for things that worked like that, functional things, not the mistakes like the appendix, but the functional things, is that they happened by natural selection. But of course, evolution will explain the appendix as well. I mean, it can explain the mistakes as well as the things that work. So it's a very satisfactory explanation, and until someone comes up with a better one, it's what I shall certainly believe. If you go to East Africa, you see these great big tall mounds, I mean 6, 7, 8 feet high, which are made by termites. They probably contain 1 million termites. The termites generate heat, and they also have a kind of fungus garden inside the termite mound where they're growing fungus on rotting wood to eat, and that gets hot. So the termite mound gets very, very hot. And it's air-conditioned in a very neat way. In the middle of the mound, there's a channel going right up the middle with hot air rising. And when it gets to the top, it comes down the sides, right underneath the surface of the mound, through a lot of narrow little channels, where it loses heat to the outside. And it's also like a lung. It gets rid of the carbon dioxide that the termites have been breathing out, and it absorbs oxygen from the air. So it's a perfect air conditioning and air cooling system. Now, it's just like a building, in other words. Now, what's fascinating to me about this is that if you came across a building like that, you'd assume that some architect had designed it, and he'd had a blueprint of some kind, right, with a drawing of how it was going to go, and he'd told people exactly what to do. Now, this termite mound, nobody had an image of the complete building. I mean, no termite has a picture of the whole mound. All the termites do is they build the mound, and they're following some rules. And to be honest, I don't think we know exactly what those rules are. My guess is that they're fairly simple. I mean, the analogue would be, you know how when they have the opening ceremony of the Olympic Games, which I never watch actually, but you see it on the news afterwards, and you have a whole set of school kids or something with different coloured clothes on, and somebody rings a bell or plays the national anthem, and half of them stand up, and you get an image of the Queen or Castro or someone or other, you know, some political figure appears. All that the child has to know is when they play this tune, stand up, when they play that tune, sit down. And she has to know what to wear, or he has to know what to wear. But they don't have to know what the picture's going to be. But the difference is, of course, somebody knows what the picture is. Somebody has told each child what to do. And they knew the picture. In the case of the termite mound, nobody knows the picture. No individual knows the picture, and yet collectively it emerges. The interesting thing, of course, is that when you were growing, when I was growing, when we were embryos, our cells were doing exactly the same thing. If you look at the cells in a growing embryo, they all seem to be moving about at random and running into one another, and it's kind of hard to make any sense of it. But they're all rule-governed. I mean, they've got a little program inside telling them what to do, and they all do it. And the result is you or me or some incredibly complicated adapted structure. But nobody had a blueprint. the shape of an embryo emerges from the rule-governed behavior of all the cells that constitute it. And yet no individual cell has an image of the thing it's trying to make. I think most biologists would agree that, well, probably they'd agree on two propositions. If they had any sense, they would. The first is that the really characteristic thing about living organisms, the thing that really cuts them aside from everything else, is that they can replicate. I mean, they produce children like themselves. They have heredity in ordinary sense. And I suppose the other thing that most sensible people would agree about is that I would say the most important discovery in science, but certainly the most important discovery in biology in this century, was the discovery by Watson and Crick of the structure of the DNA molecule. And these are connected because it is the structure of the DNA molecule that makes the heredity possible. Now, in fact, we now know that when a human child is produced, for example, but the figures would be much the same if we were talking about a cat or a robin or any other reasonably complicated animal, that a message has to be passed telling the child how to develop in the egg. It has to be there in the egg. And we know roughly how much, literally how much information has to be in that message for it to work. And in fact, it's more, quite a bit more, than the total amount of information in the books in this house. And I was working out last night, there's probably rather over 1,000 books in this house, and some of them are big fat books. There's rather more information in the DNA that the child inherits than in all those books. Now, that's by itself sounds rather remarkable. It's a lot of information. But somehow that information has to be copied. And we now know that it's copied every time a cell divides, and we know how it's copied. I mean, the details, in a sense, don't matter, but we know that it is copied. It's carried in a molecule, and that molecule, those molecules are exactly copied every time the cell divides. Occasionally a mistake is made. Every process permits of some mistakes. But the error rate, as we call it, the actual rate of making mistakes, is about 1 in 1,000 million. That's to say, if somebody were to copy all the books in this house, exactly, letter for letter, they might perhaps be allowed to make one mistake. I mean, think of it like this. If it really needs 1,000 million pieces of information to make us, which is roughly right, you really can't afford to make very many mistakes. Of course, okay, so maybe in the first generation it would be all right. I mean, the person would just be a little bit off. The next generation they'd be more off. And again, it's a matter of doing the sums, but you really cannot make more than about one mistake per generation and hope that natural selection will actually maintain the form of the organism and prevent it from just collapsing into chaos. So that degree of accuracy is necessary in order to make organisms as complicated as us. I mean, if it were not that accurate, we simply couldn't be here. As a boy, I mean, I read everything that Wells ever wrote. I read Jules Verne. And the idea that we might one day leave the surface of the Earth and get into space was a romantic dream. And when humans did actually leave the surface of the Earth and then later land on the moon and so on, I was terribly excited. I really was. Now, if I tried to justify that, it's kind of difficult. It's not solving any of the world's great problems. It's not going to solve world poverty, or it's not going to solve AIDS. It's not going to solve any of the problems that people are worried about. But what the hell? I mean, I just think it's a terribly exciting thing to have done. I do remember looking at the moon and thinking, you know, we're there. And the image of the Earth seen from space is very beautiful. But it's not just that it's beautiful, it's just that it's wonderful that we can do it. And it may be my generation who regards science as on the whole a hopeful rather than a threatening phenomenon. I was glad, I really was. I felt happy about the thought that we had got there. I think it's fashionable nowadays to regard it as a sort of waste of time, or even as a kind of threat that we're going to go out there and pollute the galaxy and so on. I can't share that view. I'm still excited. I think it was worth doing, and I think if we were able to establish human human communities on other planets, that too would be exciting and worth doing.
Roger, 1202, we copy it.
But there is a quite specific piece of science that it could tell us, and only in a sense space travel can tell us, and that is whether there's life elsewhere in the universe, and if so, what it's like. And the reason that's important, to me at least, is the following, that on the Earth we have this immensely varied collection of objects that are alive, but they all have a common origin. They all came from a single living entity, and they have a lot in common. I mean, the genetic code is common, the use of nucleic acid is common, all sorts of things are common to all living things. And what we don't know is whether they're all common to all living things, because that's the only way you can make a living organism. There's no other way of doing it. Or whether it's just an historical accident. It could have been different, but that's the way it happened here. And if we found life elsewhere, it would be quite different. In a sense, we can't have a comparative biology till we have at least two things to compare. At the moment, we've only just got the one. So it really would be very exciting for a biologist. Well, my main disappointment was there was no life on Mars. Very sad indeed. You see, scientists like universal theories. Physicists always sneer at biologists. They say, you know, our theories are universal, you know, force equals mass times acceleration everywhere, not, you know, just on Earth. You chaps are just studying a boring local phenomenon. I mean, they admit it's not all that boring, but I mean, they do say, you know, you're not really scientists because you don't have any universal ideas. Now, I would bet that all living things everywhere have certain things in common, even if they originated separately. For example, not only do they have a genetic language for talking from one generation to another, but that language will be digital, for example. It would consist of separate, discrete entities, not some kind of continuous schmear. But of course I don't know. And it would be nice to find life somewhere else and find out whether indeed it does have these common properties that I believe to be essential. And sometimes one will be wrong and discover that, gosh, no, it actually doesn't do it the way we thought was inevitable. It does it some other way. I think it would be absolutely marvellous to have life elsewhere.